Tom Luna, Michael Johnson, thank you for joining me today to dive into the recent NAEP results. We want to talk about where do we go from here. We're going to spend a few minutes talking about what the results had to say, what the results were, but we also want to spend a good amount of time talking about what can we learn from these results and what do we need to do differently. So I'm excited for this conversation. Let's jump into introductions first of all. We've got Michael Johnson, Tom Luna, and myself. I will go first real quickly. So my name's Doug Meskar. I'm the former Deputy Chief of Staff for the U.S. Department of Education. I've spent a lot of time working in policy. I'm also a former teacher, and I've spent the last 3 years as a partner at the Strategos Group. Tom, would you introduce yourself? And then Michael, you'll introduce yourself, and then we'll dive into what the NAEP results were. So Tom?
Sure, thanks, Doug. Yeah, Tom Luna, current partner at the Strategos Group and former State Superintendent of Public Instruction for the state of Idaho, and also served for 5 years on the National Assessment Governing Board. That's the organization that actually develops, administers, scores, and releases the results on the NAEP exam, which is what we're going to be talking about.
That's great.
And I'm Michael Johnson, and I am the former Commissioner of Education in the state of Alaska. Started in Alaska as an aide for special education, became a teacher, then a principal, and a superintendent there. And so delighted to be here and have this conversation.
Perfect. Well, so great to have you both, your perspectives as former chiefs, and Tom as a former member of the NAGB board. You know, there's been a lot of conversation about the 2022 NAEP results. And in some respects, right, guys, it confirmed what we were concerned about, that the pandemic had significant impacts on the learning of American public school students. I think the headline for me is how deep the losses were. And I've got a few slides just to ground us in the results so that we all are kind of working off the same set of numbers. Now, I'm not going to get into a lot of details at this point about below basic. What do these numbers even mean? Because that level of detail buries the headline a little bit. And so you can see here, we're looking at 2022 national results. So this is all of the states, all of the students across the country have been assessed. So 4th and 8th grade reading. And in both cases, they dropped 3 points. And you might be thinking 3 points is not a lot, but as you can see how flat that line is, and we're going to come back to that notion in just a minute about how flat those results have been. But in the context of a pretty flat, results year over year, a drop of 3 points is very significant. So keep that in mind as we keep moving forward. And then as we look at state by state results, it's unfortunately pretty even, meaning everybody had pretty poor results. So what I just put up is 4th grade reading results, again, national results. And these are all of the states, including Puerto Rico, DC, and then the DS in the lower left-hand side is actually the DODEA system of schools. And you can see here, 30 states decreased in 4th grade reading, 22 states had no significant change, and 0 states increased. So on that previous slide, I showed you there was a 3-point drop in 4th grade reading nationally. So when you look at the decreases, you add those all up, that means nationally we dropped 3 points. But we had 22 states, when you look at individual state scores, that stayed flat, which is good, but not great. And then as we look at 8th grade, it's actually a little bit worse. So we had 33 states decrease. We had 18 states with no change. And then the DODEA network actually increased, which is interesting. So a decline, right? So 4th grade wasn't good, right? And then 8th grade was a little bit worse. Let's take a look at math. Now, math, keep in mind, right? Different scale. So these numbers look different than reading. But in math, bigger drops. Also, right, there were bigger gains, and these numbers are a little bit higher. But in fourth grade math results nationally, we saw a 5-point drop. And then in eighth grade, we saw an 8-point drop. And you can see there, right? There's a little bit more growth. These lines are a little less flat, but these drops are pretty significant. So again, let's dig in state by state. So fourth grade for math, as you look across the country, 43 states decreased, 10 stayed the same, and 0 increased. So that's pretty rough. And then again, we see the same trend from fourth to eighth. So the eighth grade results, 51 of the states or 51 of the entities, so because we're including Puerto Rico, DC, and the Dodea schools, 51 decreased and 2 basically didn't have a significant change. So pretty rough outcomes here overall nationally. So as we sort of think about what does this all mean, one top line headline, and Michael and Tom, I want to bring you in and get your initial reactions here. In just over a year, I guess we should say, of the pandemic, it affected more than one school year. But in reading and in math, we had some pretty significant declines to the point where, particularly in reading, we're back to the levels that we saw in 92. That's 30 years ago. And in math, we're back to levels we haven't seen for 20 years. So, the declines are significant in and of themselves, but they erase decades worth of progress. So, Michael, Tom, any thoughts, any reaction to just sort of where we're at and like, how did this happen? Like, how do we sort of put this into any kind of frame of reference, I guess?
Yeah, let me just jump in. And Michael, most recently, state superintendent or commissioner of education there in Alaska, really interested in your thoughts too. But let me just jump in and just say that start with the end in mind, I guess, and that is that I hope that as we analyze these numbers and we look at these results, we recognize the seriousness of what we see, that it helps us chart a path forward, right? And when you look at going forward, the focus always has to be on improving student achievement. Now we have to amplify that. It's just obvious. We can't wait 50 years to be back to where we were in 1992, right? And if we continue to do the same things we've done in the past, we're probably going to see similar type growth. It's going to be slow, and it will never catch the current students up to where they need to be, and definitely won't prepare them for a world of the future. We can't even imagine what 2050 is going to be like and what you're going to have to know and be able to do. So that's what I would focus on. And Michael, your thoughts?
Yeah, you made me think of something with your chart, the path forward. So, in Alaska, this time of year, some of our districts actually use the river as a thoroughfare. So the river freezes and they drive up and down the river to different schools. And your comment made me think, these NAEP results remind me of that in a way, because first of all, you've got to measure the ice to see how thick it is before you can drive on it. And what these headlines remind me is that NAEP is really important. Coming out of the pandemic, we needed some kind of measure to understand what had happened and where we're at and where we need to go. And so it just reminds me how important NAEP is to this country and to where we need to go with education progress with our public education system. But it also shows us, as Doug said, how thin our improvement has been over the past 30 years. You can't drive on thin ice. You have thick ice, though, you can drive on it. And what we learned is that the gains that we made in NAEP were not enough to weather a crisis. And so what we have to do going forward is we've got to make our gains more substantive, more substantial. We've got to make improvement able to withstand the inevitable crisis or difficulties that are going to come in the life of a country and a state and a kid. And so I think those two things, one is NAEP's really important, and number two, we've got to do something to make our improvement more sustainable and stable.
So,
Doug, let me jump in and add one more point to piggyback on Michael's thoughts, and that is that when our schools were abruptly closed and education was disrupted, there was no playbook to go to, right, and say, okay, this is what we do when this happens. My only experience even close to that was the recession of 2008, which just came quickly, and revenue at the state level was just decimated across the country. But I could go back and look at previous recessions where state revenue and revenue for schools was going to be tighter because of the economy. And I had some ideas that could kind of guide me on what decisions to make and how to weather that. There was nothing like that available because we'd never experienced it. And so what this has shown us, to Michael's point, is just how fragile of a system of public education we really had. Our ability to deliver education was limited primarily to one way. And obviously the progress we had made was very vulnerable to a disruption in learning where you could lose 2-3 decades of academic gains. And so I think that's an important context as we look at this lens, through the lens going forward.
Yeah, from a nation at risk to a nation on thin ice, Michael, to use your analogy. So let's take a step back, though. You both have raised a couple of points that I think beg the question of, why do these results even matter? I mean, a number of states have come out with their own state assessment results, and kind of a mixed bag, but some states are reporting some improvements. The NAEP results, really run counter to, I think, some of the narrative that there's been some recovery from the pandemic. Can you frame this for us a little bit, guys, around why maybe these results aren't that important in the scheme of things after all?
Yeah, I'll jump in. As I said before, I think NAEP is super important. It's a calibration. And so, you've got 50 states, but we are a nation, and you have to have something to calibrate those 50 state assessments with. And I love it that, each state's able to develop their own, that sort of thing. I don't think it should replace those, but you do need a calibration for those state assessments. And I think NAEP has served that well and continues to do so, and hopefully will continue into the future. And so the other thing it does is it measures the system. And so we shouldn't misuse NAEP as a diagnostic tool for individual students or individual schools or anything like that. But it is a statement on the system. And if the system's not working well, it's going to be harder for schools and classrooms to serve individual students well. And so I think keeping it in a proper place and understanding where we are as an education system is helpful across states.
Yeah, and Doug, I'll add to that. NAEP is a consistent, right? It's the same across the 50 states and the territories, and the standard that it's measured against is the same. The assessment is the same. That just doesn't exist if you just rely solely on state standards and state assessments. You have 50 states. They develop their own standards for math and reading. They develop their own assessments. And when I was in office, I really wanted to know what was working and what wasn't working across the country, so I could, steal some good ideas if I saw a state. But when you have a situation where if a state has math standards that are lower, and they measure their students against those standards, and they report that 75% of their students met their academic math standards. Another state may have higher standards, math standards. They measure their students against that standard, and they report that only 70% of their students are met their standards. There's a perception that the state that reported the higher number of students proficient is doing better than the state that reported the lower one, but it has as much to do with the level of the standards they set. So NAEP help, and I'll give you one more specific example. Idaho is a very big state, right? So if I want to compare Boise High School to Coeur d'Alene High School, which is about 500 miles north of us, Coeur d'Alene High School in Idaho, I can do that because we have the same standards, we use the same assessment. But if I want to compare Boise High School to Ontario, Oregon High School, which is only 50 miles away, very difficult to do because those states use two different standards and two different assessments. NAEP brings that, creates that same common standard and assessment. And it's a very useful tool in that way.
So let's go deeper there for a minute, Michael and Tom. So as leaders of state systems, how did you employ the NAEP results? And Michael, really bridging off what you were talking about, and Tom as well, about, this is a reflection of how the system is doing. It's not about how an individual student on his or her own, as much as a calibration, a check, an understanding of where the system is at. So develop that a little bit more. How would you employ, for example, if you were in the seat now with these results that just came out, what would be some ideas, some thoughts that you could take these results and start to positively impact the system, using the NAEP results in ways that would move the entire enterprise forward? I just love your thoughts on that, because if that's the one of the key, powers of NAEP, if you will, one of the key things that NAEP can do for us, let's put some meat on those bones and help folks understand what does that actually mean in tangible ways.
Yeah, I'll jump in again. I think two kind of areas that I would say I would use it for. One area is to make sure our reactions, I guess, are appropriate. So in other words, let's say we showed some slight improvement, or our decrease on NAEP wasn't as much as other states, or a district showed a lot of improvement on our state assessment. NAEP is an opportunity to say, okay, let's calibrate our celebrations and let's motivate improvement. So in other words, you don't want somebody celebrating victory that's only just made slight improvement, but still compared to the rest of the country is at the bottom of the country. So, Alaska doesn't rank well compared to other states on the NAEP. I certainly want to celebrate improvement, but I don't want people to see small improvement as being where we need to be. And so NAEP helps to calibrate the celebration, but it also is an opportunity to inspire people toward improvement. It gives you something measurable. Like Tom said, it's consistent. And so you can motivate, even if a district is struggling or not improving as much as you want. NAEP is a consistent measure to inspire and motivate improvement. The other area I would say, and Tom's already referenced this, is NAEP gives you an opportunity to find pockets of improvement and find out what's going on there so that you can do that in your state or your area. And without that, especially in a state like Alaska that's tucked way up there, we have no neighboring state. It gives us an opportunity to look around the country and see good things happening and find out why, what they're doing, and how we might apply that in our own context.
I'll add to that. I think it's important with not just NAEP results, but the assessments we do at the state level and others is that they're not used or perceived to be as a club to beat somebody over the head with, right? These results are tools to help us improve. And that's how data and results are used in many other different professions and industries, is so that we can find out what's working, do more of that, identify areas where we need to improve and focus resources there. And so I think it's really important when people look at these results of NAEP that they don't immediately just use them as a club to beat somebody over the head, or the comparisons are then used to create some kind of angst, between education and others. So I think that's really critical and important to use it that way, and then focus on the fact that there are pockets of excellence. We can learn from this and identify what where schools or districts or states are doing better, and see what you can learn from them. And then, Doug, to another point, maybe we'll be back here in a year or so. We're really going to learn a lot a year from now to see with these results what kind of progress has been made, who's made the most progress, and what can we learn from them. So we've got a benchmark here. We know we have important work to do. I think there are pockets of success that we can learn from right now, but I think there's going to be just a boatload of opportunities to learn a year from now when we see the kind of progress that has been made and learned from that.
Well, absolutely, Tom. And that's a great, I think, segue to a couple of bright points that came out of the 22 administration or the 22 results. Let me go forward here. So the NAEP also does is called the Trial Urban District Assessment, TUDA. I don't make these things up. I would call it something better, but so this is a group of your larger urban districts who also get specific NAEP results. So you kind of have the national results, state level results, and then a handful of district level results. And, very similar to the states they're in at 4th and 8th grade, reading and math. But in reading in particular, I picked out this chart or a graph of the U.S. here, and there were only 4 of the urban districts. Now remember, our urban districts, right? These are the big urbans who are frequently educating students with high percentages of poverty, often students with a lot of other languages that are being spoken. High percentages of students with disabilities. These are often our most challenged students, and our most challenged districts. And so interesting here that in 8th grade reading, right? Remember that national trend, we tended to see worse results at the national level in 8th grade in both reading and math. In this case, at the district level, when we look at 8th grade, 4 of the districts decreased, 21 stayed flat, and actually one, LA, surprising to me, be one of our largest districts in the country, not for any other reason than it's just a really big district with a lot of poverty, a lot of other languages being spoken in the district, actually increased. So something went right there of some sort, right? And so there's some positive, I think, to take from this. And then I dug in a little bit further. This might be a little bit harder to read, but as I looked at Hillsborough, for example, in Florida, they were up in 4th grade reading, not only against last year, but look at nationally. They're 10 points above where national scores are in 4th grade reading. And then you look at them in 4th grade math. Something is going right in 4th grade in Hillsborough. We talked about LAUSD, Miami-Dade, again, another district in Florida, seeing some real positives there. Austin in Texas, it's not on this list here, showed some strong results as well. So we do see a few bright spots, Tom and Michael, to your points about some districts were clearly performing better than the trends, better than in some cases the national trends, and in a few different cases better than the states that they're within. So maybe they're doing something that we need to look at. Could be strategies, programs. Hard to say. I think at this point, Tom, to your point, I think we need to see multiple years of this data. But I think it also points to some narratives that I think we're starting to emerge about, how long districts or schools may have been closed to in person, the relative role of online learning. Some of these are districts like LA stayed closed to in-person learning, among the longest of any districts in the country. So also sort of, I think, counter to some of the narratives that you would hear out there about, the effects of the pandemic. So Tom, Michael, I want to bring you back into this discussion too about what we're seeing here, whether specific to these districts or just some of these bright points and what they may be telling us in terms of things we should be investigating or certain things that maybe aren't quite as impactful as maybe some of the narratives out there would lead us to believe.
I'll jump in, Michael, first, if that's all right. I'm fascinated by this information, especially when you look at some of the growth. Hillsborough up 10% or plus 10 compared to the national. Miami-Dade plus 8 in. So I mean, again, back to the point. What did they do before that not only protected the gains they'd made in the past from declines when schools were disrupted? What did they do during the pandemic that was substantially different than what others were doing? And how did that lead to not only preserving the gains they'd made in the past, but actually making, in some cases, very impressive improvement from where they were before? So again, where are those pockets of success? A state like Idaho with 300,000 kids, we can look at a larger district and it's very comparable in student size, right? Like LA Unified is almost 3 times bigger than Idaho as a whole, right? So there's some things that can be learned, and that's what I would do. And Michael, you can jump in on this. This would definitely be a conversation I'd be having with senior staff for them to identify, what was being done in these districts, what's working, and then what can we do to replicate that and replicate that success.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And we'll just say this represents a huge opportunity for our country, for states, for districts, because what I hope is that there'll be a substantial investment in researching and studying why this is what we see on this slide. And like you said, Tom, what did they do before, during, and after that produced these numbers? I think this is really a huge opportunity. And I just really hope that we don't miss it as a country, because we don't know exactly why these numbers are like they are. We have some indications, for the districts in Florida, we've been seeing improvement over years. We know some things they're doing that have shown improvement. But like Doug said, LA, they were closed longer than almost anybody. So we have to ask the question, was what was happening in the classroom keeping kids from learning somehow in a way that being out of the classroom, doing things online that were enhancing their learning? In other words, this is not a criticism or of what was happening. It's just maybe we've learned something about our students that we didn't know before, and how they learn and how we can accelerate and maximize their growth as students. So I think we have to dive in and find out what was happening. Why did some students benefited from the online learning? Some students didn't. But there's something in there that we can learn about how students learn that we can benefit from going forward. So I think this is fascinating data, but I think it's also represents a huge responsibility that we dig into it and find out why, because I think it can make a huge difference going forward.
So totally agree, gentlemen, and want to open this up to a little bit broader discussion. I thought I might start with the question of, sort of the the laws of the physical universe, right? Equal and opposite reactions. There's a part of me that would love to think, well, if we can decline as quickly as we did, couldn't we also increase the opposite amount really quickly as well? Now, certainly things would have to change and be different. But Tom, you sort of talked about this early on. In some cases, it took 20, 30 years to see pretty minor, modest gains. We can't be here in 2050 saying, well, we're back to where we were in 2022. That's a travesty on so many levels. And so I guess the question comes back to one, it's a question of belief, and then secondly, a question of like, can we, or a question of possibility. One, can we make those quick and large gains in the other direction? And two, if we can, what would need to change? And I know we can't necessarily say specifically this, and this, but beyond, we just can't keep doing the same things we've always done. I'd love your thoughts as former leaders of state systems. What comes to mind, when we think about, okay, we have to respond, we have to do things differently. What does that mean exactly when we say that? Like, can you put a little bit more detail around what would be some things you would think about if you were in the chair talking to your senior staff? Tom, I think you may be on mute.
Wow, sorry about that. Let me just say, I think this is a real opportunity. I think we all recognize that the pandemic, the abrupt closure of schools, it didn't create as many challenges for education as it did expose challenges that have been there for some time, but we've just never chose to deal with them or dealt with them, right? And so the education is very rigid and very resistant, to change, and we call it modernization, whatever you want to call it. And I think it was kind of exposed with in these past couple of years. I tell people, imagine if, for example, banking had not progressed and used the tools of technology and communications that are currently available, and we had this sudden closure of our country, and the only way people could get access to their funds or make any kind of financial transaction was you had to go to a lobby of a bank and stand in line and wait to see a teller face to face. All of that was abruptly closed, but because banking had modernized, that whole relationship with the bank remained in place, and people were able to do their work and their commerce because of the benefits of technology. It's not as simple of a translation from the modernization banking has done that what needs to happen in education, but I think it's an example of a real eye opener for folks in education about the need to modernize and to look at how we can use tools of technology to empower teachers, to we don't have to limit learning to the four walls of a classroom and a bell schedule and a school calendar, right? Learning can happen anytime, anywhere, any place with the proper training and the proper tools. So I think those are some of the things that we should be talking more about and emphasizing more, and then recognizing that we've put a whole generation at risk if we don't make substantial progress quickly in academic achievement. Michael?
Yeah, I would just, in addition to all the things Tom said, I really think that we have to talk a lot more about durability. And I wonder if durability is the way to see greater improvement over time. So in other words, we haven't talked a lot about durability. And I wonder if the reason we haven't made enough gains over the last 20 years is because there is a lot of up and down, even from NAEP assessment to NAEP assessment over 2 years. And so rather than a steady trajectory, over the course of 2 years, we may just be making up losses that happen. And so I wonder if we could spend a fair amount of time talking about durability, because what we saw with this NAEP results is that the improvements over the last number of years was not durable enough to withstand the pandemic. And I get it. The pandemic was a once in a lifetime event, but there'll always be challenges that will affect our assessment results if they're not durable. And so going forward, I think we have to have a lot of conversation about how do we have durable improvement as a system. And if we make our improvements more durable, then they'll compound and be greater. So rather than thinking of just how do I increase scores rapidly, how do I make each incremental improvement durable so that I can build on top of that and not have to keep rebuilding the improvements that I've had?
I think those are great points. And Doug, I think when you can also drill this down, you can't do it with NAEP results, but NAEP, shines a bright light on this down to an individual child having durable academic progress, right? Because you can show a trajectory if you look at just a certain percentage of the students, right? But if you want to look at all the students, how do we create that durable academic achievement down to the individual student level? That's when you'll see these kinds of scores and these kind of results take off like a rocket ship.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it seems, to me, there were some pieces in place, as the pandemic was hitting, or even right before it, that may be accelerated now. An example being, there's been a lot of conversation around the science of reading. You see a number of states putting legislation, policy into place to emphasize, using evidence-based, scientifically proven reading strategies, which as someone who goes back to, 20 plus years to when some of this first came around, I sort of wonder what took us so long, but, setting that aside for a minute, I wonder, right, when you look at the reading results and how flat they've been, maybe this effort, and you see some of the major, players in the market starting to shift in this direction, maybe using evidence will finally take hold in ways that it hasn't before. I'm encouraged by that. That may actually yield some reading results, because you see Carrie Wright in Mississippi is maybe the poster, state for using the science of reading to improve results. And Mississippi's been, nothing short of miraculous in some, camps in terms of their improvement. So we need more of that. And I do feel that there's a greater sort of recognition and acceptance. Here's another trend that I'm hopeful about. There's a lot of conversation around, well, we have to personalize learning. We have to make it more, tailored to each student's path. And I don't just mean, their interests. I mean, where they're at academically. I have kids in school and they're in certain grades, but they're all over the place in terms of, year over year, where they're at in terms of their mastery of content. And I think coming out of the pandemic, our ability to better tailor where our instruction, where our content is at relative to where students are at, So we're not just always teaching to the middle and then trying to help kids who are ready to move on, right? And then trying to support kids who are not quite there yet. Like that model, sort of where you're waiting for failure before kids get extra support, I think is starting to change, which is tied to my last trend. And then I want you guys to react, is just the reality of the human capital challenges, that it's not everywhere in the same way, but there's clearly, the teaching profession is significantly challenged, whether it's having enough teachers or enough qualified teachers, enough teachers who are, really moving the envelope, moving moving students forward with progress, right? And in measurable ways. I think we've got so much room to improve. I think coming out of the pandemic, we're having to solve for the human capital challenges in different ways, which may be tied to a little bit of that personalized learning piece that I talked about, where we have to think about how we reach and teach every student in different ways. We can't just sort of do the cohorts and do it the same way we've always done it. I'm hopeful that some of those types of trends and some of those seeds will sprout and grow into changes that will take us to, we're still talking about the public education system here. We're still talking about the vast majority of kids going to their local public schools, but getting something that looks and feels a little bit different than even that happened 2 or 3 years ago, and will produce measurably better results. I'd love, Tom or Michael, your reactions to any or all of that.
Michael?
Yeah, I think, what validates everything you just said, Doug, is that the reading scores haven't been flat everywhere. So there are places in the country where the reading scores haven't been flat. Florida is an example, especially in their low-income students. Remarkable improvement over the last 20 years. And so that validates what you said, that, we have examples of places where the results have been more durable and enduring. And we can't be stuck in, because we can't be stuck because we don't know what to do. And you're right, this represents a huge opportunity. Kind of on our previous conversation, what was happening in those districts that saw some improvement or less decline than everywhere else? What was happening in that remote learning? Because there was remote learning happening. And so I think it's a huge opportunity. I think where states need to be thinking is, who all can I bring into the conversation going forward? So because we know that what we were doing in the last 20 years didn't produce durable results, let's bring in a whole lot of people that haven't been part of the conversation in the last 20 years and help us think about how can we seize this opportunity and new technologies and new flexibilities in the system to have improvement going forward. Where I think it will be stymied is in those places that refuse to embrace the flexibility that we learned we could have during the pandemic.
I was just thinking, Michael, that for the past 10, 15 years, up until the time you left office in Alaska, you've seen states and districts kind of struggle and debate the value of distance learning. And in Alaska, you've been doing it for a long, long time, right? Because out of necessity, you had to adapt. I think that's where we're at across the country now. Out of necessity, we have to adapt. And I would add, when you talk about people being at the table that maybe haven't been as much, I would, parents, we know how critical it is to have parents engaged and involved in their child's education, making that more parent engagement a lot easier and also more productive, right? Because it needs to be productive and helpful in the education process. And Doug, to your point about teachers, we've known for about 10, 15 years that we were coming into an age where we were going to experience teacher shortage just because of an aging population. The pandemic has only amplified that, right? And so all across the country, you see districts and schools struggling just to put teachers in the classroom. And at the same time, the teachers that are there are stressed and a lot is been placed upon them. So I think the work that we do to empower teachers, we know from Dr. Marzano from his studies, that the most important factor once a child enters the classroom is the quality of the teacher in the classroom. There's nothing more important. It's not the curriculum you use. It's not the number of kids in the classroom. It's not how much money you spend. All of those are important, but by far the most important factor is the quality of the teacher. So how do we build the quality of the teacher in the classroom? Professional development, and flexibility and autonomy with the right level of responsibility that comes with that. I think those all have to be on the table and part of the discussion. And then we have to look at our colleges of education that are preparing the next generation of teachers. What kind of training are pre-teachers getting there? Is it really preparing them for the classroom of today? And then I think you need multiple on-ramps into the teaching profession. It can't be, you go to college, you get a 4-year degree in education, you get a teaching certificate, and then you become a teacher for 30 years. That there has to be more on-ramps than just that into the classroom. You see a lot of states that are embracing those different routes to teacher certification. I think it's a combination of all of that is critical to being able to close this gap and accelerating beyond it.
And I'll just jump in, Tom, and agree with all of that, and say that all of these different elements work together to make all of these things possible. So like the multiple on-ramps for teachers, all that we've seen happen during the pandemic, the new technologies or whatever, the flexibility, I think, opens up more opportunities for other folks to enter the teaching profession if we lead it well and make it all work together. The other thing I would just say is, as we go forward and have these conversations, I want to keep saying that even if the pandemic hadn't happened, we're at a place of great opportunity in this country because of technology and other things. The pandemic just highlighted it, focused our attention on it, intensified it maybe, but the opportunity would have been there even if the pandemic hadn't happened. And so that makes it even more of a responsibility to seize the opportunity, and more of a tragedy if we don't.
Yes.
Absolutely. Michael, that's such a great frame. I think, let's end our conversation, or at least pause it there. I would love to circle back, Tom, to your point, a year, from now, or just in the future, and see where we've gone. I do believe we are capable of turning this around and reversing these declines, and talking a year or two from now about these amazing increases we're seeing, and pretty soon knitting those together to a national picture that is much better than it is today. And by the way, Tom, to borrow a line that you often mention, make us much more competitive globally, which is something that we don't talk as much about. We've been pretty focused on our own internal results and how we're doing nationally, which is incredibly important, but that has to translate to our global competitiveness as well. Well, gentlemen, this has been a terrific conversation, the beginning of a conversation. Let's keep it going. We do have, Tom and I have some contact information here. Michael, I didn't have yours to put up here, but if anybody wants to reach Michael, feel free to reach out to us and we'll get you in touch. Michael, let me just say, it was so great to have you and your perspective join us for this conversation. I'll hope you'll join us for future conversations along these lines as well.
Definitely. Absolutely. Thank you. It was great fun. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Tom, any last words?
Thanks for the opportunity, Michael. It's always great to see you, and good to see you. And I think it'll be a very interesting conversation going forward to see how all of our efforts result in taking advantage of this opportunity and helping prepare our kids for the future that they will graduate into.
Absolutely. Gentlemen, thank you. For everyone out there watching, thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.